Hey, what's up, everybody? Jonathan Bailor and April Perry back with another sane show, and we're gonna be rapid fire today, April, because I know you got a bunch of good stuff you want to cover. What is on the agenda for today's sane show?
Today, we're talking about the slight edge of sane. And this comes from a book called The Slight Edge, which I've loved. And I just love the concept of it, which is that most of the results that we get in life are not because we did something once really well. It's because there's certain things that we do repeatedly over time that yield results. So when we talk about sane being long-term health, long-term fitness, having really great health so we can enjoy our families and live our purpose. I love that. But at the same time, I have questions as far as what are the things that if we just make little changes over time will make a big difference? Because when you're going sane, there's so many choices that you can make as far as, do I want to eat the optimal vegetables? Jonathan suggests we sleep 7 hours. What about 6 hours and 45 minutes? Or, there's all kinds of little ways that you can go into the gray or ways that you can sub-optimize your sanity. So I have a bunch of different suggestions and things I could ask you, but first I thought it would be great to hear from you as far as your perspective on what are those things that you feel like really give people that slight edge that help them take off.
The slightest and most significant edge that someone could make is gradually increasing their intake of non-starchy vegetables. No questions asked. Also, because that's where, if you look at the average person in the Western world, just where we're starting from is so. I mean, there's very few people who consistently sleep 1 hour per night, for example. But imagine we had a country that was full of people who consistently slept 1 hour per night. We would say, oh my goodness, just getting an additional hour of sleep, you've doubled the amount of sleep you've gotten now.
Right.
That's going to be a slight edge, but it's going to make a big difference. So the average American eats 0 servings of green leafy vegetables per day. 0.
That
So,
is sad. That's really sad.
it's very sad. So here is the ultimate slight edge. If even just monthly, if monthly you can figure out a way to add 1 more serving of green leafy vegetables into your lifestyle, such that basically after a year, you would then be up to 12, that slight edge would so drastically, I personally think that in and of itself would end the obesity epidemic.
I love that. Okay, so that's a really easy one. Can we talk a little bit about sleep for a second? Because this is one of those things that's so hard for me to get in bed by 10 or 10:30, make sure I get 7 hours, even 8 would be optimal. I notice I feel better when I do, but where does that fall?
Sleep is going to be like vegetables, where of course the closer we get to the optimal range, that's going to be extremely positive. But in terms of the slight edge for sleep, I mean, the getting an additional 15 minutes, figuring out a way to get an additional 15 minutes nightly per month. I mean, if we could just say, hey, this month, I'm going to try to make this change to my lifestyle. I'm going to try to not watch this show or turn off this screen so that I'm going to get 15 more minutes of sleep. I think that's the biggest thing, April, and you do a really good job of talking about this. Where oftentimes it's really easy to get excited and just say, I'm going to change everything instantly. And then nothing changes. And then we get discouraged. But when we bite size these things, like if we were to say, hey, over the next month, can you figure out a way to go to bed 15 minutes earlier?
I love that. Well, one of the ways I've been doing that is if I want to watch a TV show, for example, but I'm tired and it's getting to bedtime, I'll say, I'll just lay down, and if I'm still awake in 15 minutes and I want to watch something, then I can. But I'm always asleep within 5, and so then I don't even miss it. So that's been helpful.
And for what it's worth, when it comes to sleep, in terms of the slight edge, I know a challenge a lot of people have is just falling asleep or sleeping in general. Just how do I can totally figure out how to budget 7 hours to sleep if need be. I just can't fall asleep. And this is one area where I think a slight edge is going to be here, and in general, really, you got to listen to yourself a little bit. Here's what I mean by that. Almost universally, you get this recommendation, which is the last thing you should ever do is have a television in your room and watch television before you go to sleep. So that is like, drink more water, right? I mean, that is like gospel generally.
Right. But see, now you don't even have to have a television set in your room. You can have a smartphone and
Exactly. Yeah.
Netflix, and there you go, right?
And right. And however, like the slight edge, here's a slight edge I've discovered in my life. For me, the easiest way for me to fall asleep without question, and this includes like sleeping medication, it's more effective than sleeping medication, is turning on a show on Netflix that I've already seen and just letting it play while I close my eyes and listen to it. And then I'll fall asleep for like 5 minutes and then I'll turn it off and then I'll instantly fall asleep. It's the most effective. But again, I shouldn't do that. According to the internet, I should never do that, but it works for me. So I think that's a big slight edge there, is stop looking outside and look inside and consistently do that. You're going to get really good results.
I love that. And you know what? An audiobook, or even a boring audiobook, is better. It'll totally put you to sleep, and no light. Okay, so let's talk about standing for a minute, because I never stood at a desk until I saw that you stood hours and hours every day at your desk. Is that one of those slight edge things that makes a difference? Because like this last week, for example, I've been making a point to really stand. I've been moving my laptop down to my kitchen counter where I can stand there. I prop up my laptop. I'm standing in my office more. Is that something that, if you do it consistently over time, is going to make a difference as well?
It absolutely is. And it's not even a slight edge. I think some of these things, there's some items that are, some of these are different kinds of, let's say, slight edges, just to pop up a level. Like, for example, vegetables, sleep, standing. These are things I think we know that there is a ideal state. And when we talk about slight edge, we're talking about making gradual steps towards that ideal state. Then I think there's kind of another class, which is, for example, eating this form of vegetable versus that form of vegetable, or eating this form of beef versus that form of beef. And those are the things that are generally more marketed as like tricks or secrets, or if you just change eating this nut to eating that nut. So when we're talking about these things that are more, we know there's an ideal state, like we know we should be sleeping more, we know we should be eating more vegetables, we know that standing is better than sitting. I think the slight edge there that we can have is figuring out ways, either weekly or every other week, to just tack on either 15 minutes or one serving. So what is one task you generally do seated that takes 15 to 20 minutes that you can do standing? And then every week, just add one of those. And then slowly the slight edge of saying, I'm going to take small steps weekly, will make a big difference over the long term.
Okay, and I like that, because generally if I know, okay, it's better to stand than to sit, but then if it's the afternoon, it's kind of been a long day, and I think, well, seriously, is standing up for the next 10 minutes really going to make that big of a difference? You know, it's one of those questions you ask yourself, because you're like, oh, if my seat's really comfy, I can, feel a little more comfortable while I'm working. But I think it's just that question of, okay, of course you can take a rest if you need it, but being able to say, hey, but I could stand up for half of this meeting or something like that. Right?
And it does add up certainly over time. I know there's a slight edge. This isn't a financial podcast, but I know you're super familiar with this idea, and it's it seems like it's a little bit, but it adds up over time, right? So even financial stuff, we're like, I'm going to just buy this $5 Starbucks coffee. It's only $5. When you look at it over the course of the year, I mean, my wife's work is a great example, not to get too sidetracked, but she mentions how very few people at her office bring their lunch to work. So they end up going and getting food. So going to get food takes 30 minutes minimum. And then it's downtown Seattle, so it's $15 minimum. They work 5 days a week. That's 15 times 5 is, say, $75 per week. Multiply that by 50 weeks in a year. Looking at a couple grand per year. And then you're looking at a couple days out of your life per year to get that stuff. And while that sounds like, in the moment per day, it's not that big of a deal. When you look at it over a year, so even that 10 minutes, like if you could just tack on 10 minutes per day, or one serving per day for a year, one serving of vegetables per day for a year is 365 servings of vegetables. That's a lot of vitamins and minerals you wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Okay, so I love that. Now I want to talk about some of those little ideas you were referring to, things like the nuts. Like I think you've said macadamia nuts are better than almonds, and raw nuts are better than roasted. I mean, talk about that a little bit.
There's a lot of variations in terms of these slight optimizations within the SANE food groups. And this might actually be, we could probably cover a couple quick tips in many different shows, because like when it comes to nuts, for example, there's a huge difference between, for instance, peanut, which is actually not a nut at all. It's a legume, versus something like a almond. which is a nut, in fact. And then there's almonds that have been soaked in sugar and have been roasted. And then there are raw almonds. So the key thing to keep in mind with all of these minor tweaks, some are less minor than others. For example, the difference between eating a lot of honey roasted peanuts and eating raw macadamia nuts is actually a big deal, because honey roasted peanuts have a bunch of artificial nonsense in them, and they're very easy to overeat because of that. Whereas raw macadamia nuts are really, really different. Now, if you're eating plain roasted almonds versus raw almonds, is that going to be the thing that finally helps you to take control of your diabetes? Probably not. I mean, it will add up over time.
Okay.
Right. But does that help?
So some are slighter, right? There's some things that are bigger, like a peanut that's honey roasted. Don't even really count that as your nuts, right? So, okay, I get that. Now, what about things like oil? Using olive oil, you said coconut oil is a better option for cooking than olive oil. Is that right? Because olive oil becomes a trans fat when it's heated. Am I remembering this right?
You are. And in some ways, this is a great recording for us to do, but it's hard for me because, as you know, I really stress all the time, focus, don't let the small things get in the way of the big things. And especially with the advent of the internet, like I can just list out crazy things you can worry about, like use this cooking oil versus that cooking oil, and then use this brand of that cooking oil versus that brand. But then this
these questions stress us out when we're trying to make the decision. So I get it. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. But I think here's the slight edge. Here's the ultimate slight edge. Understand and embrace the fact that, for instance, if you're eating nuts as your snack instead of eating Doritos, that is a major macro foundational edge that will transform your life. And then we can certainly refine within that category, but just don't let it overwhelm you. So macadamia nuts, for example, are raw macadamia nuts would be one of the best nuts you could ever eat because they're incredible sources of monounsaturated fats. These are the same fats that make olives so healthy. And if you think olives and olive oil are a good source of them, macadamia nuts are an even richer source of them.
Okay.
However, is anybody who is struggling with their health and weight loss because they're eating almonds and not macadamia nuts? Now, some person selling you macadamia nuts will probably say yes, but the answer is no. So just keep that in mind, that all of these things, they are slight edges. They're fun, but they're not the key thing that we should be focused on.
Okay, no, it's helpful. When you and Angela were visiting, I just noticed there were a lot of little things that you did that were different than things I do. For example, we were chopping kale, and there's those really bitter kale stalks that are in the middle that most parents will just throw out because their kids don't want to eat them. And I thought it was interesting that you were like snacking on these kale stalks, and you just said, "Hey, nothing goes to waste." And we were making the green smoothies, and you're putting in the little end of the romaine lettuce. I mean, kind of random things. And so I thought, well, but that's really interesting. I mean, I totally eat the kale stalks all the time now because I think, oh, nothing goes to waste. But I just thought that was one of those little things, like how many extra little servings of vegetables are being included just by doing things like that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Little things definitely add up over time. For example, if you were to combine saying, I'm going to make this slight tweak of, instead of eating carrots and green beans as my vegetables, this slight tweak of actually switching to Swiss chard and kale, which I actually would argue is not a slight tweak. It's actually that's a big
one,
edge,
but,
and then going from conventional beef to grass-fed beef is also, that's not a. Now, for example, the different cuts of grass-fed beef, that would be something that is actually too slight to make that much of a difference. And these things, but they help. But there's an actual term in in computer science that it applies to other areas of engineering, which I think are helpful because oftentimes we want to design or engineer our lives. And that is over-optimization or optimizing too early. So by way of analogy, imagine if we've all probably tried to write something before, right? So if you've taken any sort of writing classes or had anyone instruct you on how to write, they generally say, just write, just get it on paper first,
Yeah.
and then edit it later. Now, editing can take a long time, right? And you can change this word
Oh
this
my
way,
gosh.
and it's a slight edge if I use this synonym versus that. But if what you've written is garbage, it doesn't really matter how many slight edges you have,
It's
right?
true. Okay. You know, I really like that perspective because, yes, at Power of Moms, we published 2 books and I was the project manager. And my arms, I seriously had muscle problems because I was on my mouse, you know, fixing margins and little things and just going through and doing way too much editing. But you're right. It's just, I like the idea of getting all the right things in and then making little improvements over time. Now, I do have a question about things like going to the gym. So I've been doing my eccentric exercises. I've been trying to up the weights that I'm lowering. And I'm a wimp, Jonathan. I'm sorry to say this. I just am. When I think, okay, if Eric were here watching me work out, he would totally be laughing because I have a really quick, release point when I just want to be done. But is there this slight edge of holding on for 10 more seconds when you feel like it's just too hard, or 5 more seconds, or 1 more second? I mean, how does that apply to kind of the weights and exercise?
The reason I keep, so I'll answer this question, April, but I think it's just a definitional problem. Like it's a little bit like asking, so yes, but I don't think it's a slight edge. So let me give you by way of, I think it's a major edge. For example, when weight training, this is a perfect example. When weight training, if you're doing repetitions, right? And so let's say your goal is to do 6 repetitions, and like the first repetition is pretty easy. The second repetition is good. They get harder and harder and harder, right? There's one repetition in weight training. It's called the point of failure. And weight training is one of the few areas of life where failure is the desired state. You want to completely fail. Now, one might say it's a slight edge just to get that one additional repetition, but it's actually not a slight. I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, that's like, you know, that's like saying the slight edge of being pregnant is whether or not, you know, the sperm and egg actually meet. Like they either meet or they don't. Like it's not really a slight edge. It's binary. So you either exhaust
your muscles
or you don't, you know. So I guess I just don't think it's a slight edge. I think we've got these big transformational things in our lives.
Well, this is really helpful to me because I think in my mind, the part of your mind that's saying, this is hurting, I'm tired, I want to be done. That mind is saying, well, I've already been lifting weights. Yeah, this is kind of sore. You know what I mean? It's just easy to kind of rationalize. And I think what happens is when I would rationalize, I am defeating the purpose of why I'm there, like never quite getting to that point. And so I think it's really helpful to recognize it's not just about holding on for a couple more seconds. It's making sure you actually achieve what you came here to do.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the takeaways from this, at least from me, because I appreciate you for pressing me on these sort of slight edge things, is the way my mind works, at least, is it seems it's either worth it. It's either worth thinking about or it's not. I don't think there's anything that's either like kind of worth thinking about, because we've got a lot of stuff going on in our lives. So like if vegetables are worth thinking about, then to me, that's not even a slight edge. Like that's a macro edge. If reaching muscular failure is the brand of cod liver oil you use worth worrying about? I mean, I think the major edge is cod liver. Cod liver oil is great for you. Now, the brand, is that what's going to make the big difference? I don't know, you know?
Okay. All right. One more question on specifics, and then we can do a little final wrap up. Dark chocolate chips that are like SANE, from the SANE store. Actually, I'm really excited to talk about this. You have amazingly SANE, awesome food at the SANE store. There's also dark chocolate or semi-sweet chocolate chips you can buy. Maybe help us understand that, like where in our food and the quality of our food, where is that slight edge going to help us the most, and where should we be paying attention?
Food or chocolate in general, I think gets back to that. It's not raw macadamia nut versus unraw macadamia nut. It's sugar isn't good for you. Refined sugar is never good for you, right? Just like smoking, it's not a slight edge to go from 2 cigarettes to 1. It's a big edge because cigarettes aren't good for you. So for example, organic raw cacao nibs, which is what we sell, which is pure cacao. There's no sugar, there's no additives, no nothing.
Okay.
The ingredients are one thing. One could argue that that's a slight edge over 90% dark chocolate, which is only then has, 10% sugar and other nonsense.
Okay.
But I guess it's just a definition of a slight edge. I mean, we can make these compromises and trade-offs, and a little bit of sugar gets into our diet via this, and then a little bit of sugar gets into our diet via our ketchup, and then a little bit of added sugar, and then pretty soon we're eating 70 grams of added sugar per day, and we're like, and then that slight compromise actually turns into an obesity epidemic, which is what we have, because over time we've had these slight compromises to our food quality.
Okay, that's really helpful. Well, and I think what this has helped me to realize is just that there is hope in continuing to improve and refine. Because I think what happens is when you go SANE and you want to continue progressing, you want to continue improving the quality of what you're eating, it's just good to know that you can start improving this quality, working out better, making these decisions to be consistent. That makes me feel excited.
And April, can I give one more analogy? Because I think it's actually going to be really, really helpful. It's not that these refinements aren't a good idea, but so for example, Olympic athletes, the only thing that differentiates the gold medal winner from the silver medal winner is a slight edge. It's a minute 1/1000th of a second. The reason it matters is like the more world-class you get, the more all that's left are slight edges. But like if you're just getting started, right? Like if you're suffering with pre-diabetes and you're not sleeping at all, you're looking for these sort of big things you can take care of. Right. And then the further and further you get, that's like taking a D paper to a B isn't done through little slight tweaks. It's done through macro overhauls, but taking an A paper to an A plus. So I think we have to look at where we're starting from. The reason you saw all those nuances me and Angela did is because we've been doing this for a really long time, and that's all that's left for us.
Okay,
but for people who are just getting started, that's not what they need to be worried about right now.
Okay. Well, I think that's really helpful. I always feel comforted, like, all right, I can just keep learning and keep going. But yeah, especially when it comes to our children, let's get the green vegetables in, let's get the sugar out of the house. Let's just figure out how to do those things first. Then we can worry more about brands and all the things that are a little bit smaller and aren't as big of a deal.
I think that's exactly right, April.
Okay, so next action, I have one suggestion, which is just thinking about what you heard here on today's podcast, or looking at your own place in sanity, if you're just getting started or if you're more refining your process. Just identify one thing that you could do to give yourself that slight edge, whether it's standing 15 more minutes a day, going to bed 15 minutes earlier, changing out something you're eating for something that's more optimal. Just make one decision to move forward a little bit closer. Any other suggestions you have?
I think that's fabulous. And I would say the stretch goal is to, anytime a thought enters your mind in terms of, does this thing matter? I don't think the question we need to ask ourselves is, does it matter? It probably matters. The question is, does it matter more than everything else that I have to take care of? If the answer is no, you'd be better off, for example, getting your vegetables on lock, getting your sleep in on lock, getting your stress on lock, having more love in your life. Like if those are on lock, then you can worry about it. So the question, the stretch goal, is to get into the mental mindset of not asking yourself, hey, should I worry about this or not? Because we can worry about everything. It's, should I worry about this instead of everything else that I have to worry about?
Right
now. We only
now.
have a fixed amount of space in our brain, right?
Love it. All right. Thanks, Jonathan.